Hi, Mr. Shapiro. How's it going?
Hey, sorry I'm late. Like I said, I just got back late last night from being abroad for a week and just have back-to-back Zooms all day.
Not a worry at all. We actually just finished a pretty eventful event yesterday with Dr. Kevin Roberts from
Right,
Heritage.
you rescheduled that for March, yeah.
Yeah, it was ended up being quite exciting. There was a couple hundred protesters that were outside, and to say the least, it's nice to actually have an event where we don't have to worry about the having massive security presence, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person to create, back-to-back things like that for you, but here I am.
No, absolutely. So I figured I could do a brief introduction and then you could sort of lead off in terms of giving us sort of your background, talk about the book, talk about your experience. I think last night was very interesting because although we had an event on federalism, the participants both sort of ended up touching on a bunch of different topics, ranging from LGBT issues to the state of academia, to current politics. And it was great to be able to have both someone who, is able to at least take on sort of the liberal view, and obviously someone who's able to fill that conservative viewpoint. But I think where you're really able to lend your expertise is being someone who's actually worked in legal academia and had that experience as a conservative and been able to sort of see all of the different ramifications that have sort of transpired over the various years, if that makes sense. Both internally in academia as well as externally. The Cato Institute, where I believe you were before joining Georgetown's Center for the Constitution. Um, and now you're at the Manhattan Institute. And we're delighted to be able to hear about Lawless and sort of your insights into legal academia. And yeah, I think that's about it for us.
Great. By the way, your Zoom background is backwards, the wording of the slide thing with your logo. Um,
Oh, thank goodness. I appreciate it. I actually had switched that because it was coming the other way. So I'm glad to know that I'll switch it back.
yeah, so I'm glad to be here. Those who are, I heard you talking that you have like 15 or 20 people or something, and I guess that's the hardcore that already probably knows something about my background. I think we all recognize there's a crisis in higher education, one that was thrust into the national discourse after October 7th. And it's amazing that the heart of anti-Semitism in America lies on campus among the most educated and so-called progressive people in the country. As Bill Ackman, the billionaire Harvard alum and donor, put it in an essay published, as it happens, the same day that Harvard president Claudine Gay resigned in January of last year, anti-Semitism is the canary in the coal mine, a warning about larger issues. It's a leading indicator of cultural pathologies, of underlying pathologies, which here means everything from cancel culture to indoctrination, intellectual corruption to moral decay. We've seen a subversion of the core mission of universities to seek truth and knowledge and of classical liberal values like free speech, due process, equality under the law. These things are seen as tropes of white supremacy, what have you. It's been a shift from education to activism, and the root cause of all of this is a noxious postmodern ideology that contends that truth is subjective and has to be viewed through lenses of race, gender, and other identity categories according to some privilege hierarchy. So your rights and freedoms depend on whether you're part of a class deemed oppressor or oppressed. Erwin Chemerinsky, who's the dean of Berkeley Law, wrote soon after the Hamas attacks and the ensuing chaos on campus that as a 70-year-old Jewish man, quote, never in my life have I seen or felt the anti-Semitism of the last few weeks. Well, some of us were less surprised given the anti-Israel, anti-American, and generally anti-Western ideology that's taken root in higher education. And indeed, some of us have a lived experience with this sort of thing. This is a nice, polite Zoom. If I were on campus, maybe something similar to what happened to Kevin Roberts would have happened. Things like that have happened to me in the past. I was shouted down, for example, at the school formerly known as UC Hastings, now known as UC Law San Francisco. 3 years ago, it was like an Occupy Wall Street meeting. Everyone was chanting and banging, and we didn't have this event. There was a heckler's veto. Even though the dean said that it was against the rules, nobody was disciplined. And this was, of course, in the context of my larger investigation, inquisition from Georgetown after a tweet criticizing President Biden's restriction of his nomination selection criteria for the Supreme Court by race and sex. At the end of all of that, I was reinstated on the technicality that I hadn't yet been a Georgetown employee when I tweeted, so these rules against harassment and anti-discrimination didn't apply. But the report I then got in my email inbox from the Office of Institutional Diversity, Equity, and Affirmative Action, IDEA, set me up for discipline the next time that I transgressed progressive orthodoxy. Basically, they said the next time I offended someone, I'd create a hostile educational environment. And I realized after consulting with trusted advisors, my lawyer, Professor Randy Barnett, who hired me to run the Georgetown Center for the Constitution, my wife, who's a better lawyer than any of us, that I simply could not do the job I was hired to do, whether internally teaching classes, organizing student programs, externally advocating for originalism, and the like. Clearly, in commenting on controversial constitutional issues, I would be offending someone in a way we go back to the Inquisition. So I made what lawyers call a noisy exit, publishing my resignation letter in the Wall Street Journal and then announcing my move to the Manhattan Institute on Fox News. And I didn't ask for this platform or this spotlight, but I've become the poster boy, not so much for cancel culture, but for shining a light on the rot in academia. Now, I'm generally optimistic about America, and perhaps we're past peak woke generally. People talk about this vibe shift, right? Not just the election, that was just a political instantiation, but in the culture more broadly. But on campus, we may have passed the point of no return in terms of the illiberal takeover, which is particularly dangerous in law schools, because after all, where you are, these institutions train the gatekeepers of our legal and political institutions. And I want to make clear that I do mean illiberal. This is not, the argument I'm making is not the latest iteration of the decades-old conservative complaint about liberal professors, right? The original, takeover there, the Berkeley hippies and the free speech movement in the 60s, they'd now be considered retrograde white supremacists. But we see that illiberal dominance from a vocal minority that's placated by weak educational leaders. University officials facilitate and even foment social justice mobs. Recall 2 years ago the shoutdown of Judge Kyle Duncan, Fifth Circuit judge at Stanford Law, where the DEI dean egged on the mob and had her own prepared remarks to talk about whether his juice was worth the squeeze and the harm that his mere presence was there, which I think is emblematic of why DEI is completely contradictory to any educational mission. And I want to be clear about this as well, because it's not about the dictionary definitions of diversity, equity, inclusion. There's nothing wrong. And in fact, it's a good thing to have people with different perspectives, different viewpoints. That makes for a richer discussion, prevents groupthink. That's great. Equity is a centuries-old concept in Anglo-American law that, for the layman, boils down to treating people fairly. Who could object to, we want people to feel welcome, included where they're working or where they're going to school. But the problem is how these are applied consciously, purposely by purveyors of, I call it the diversity and industrial complex, is in an Orwellian sense the opposite of what those good words mean. So to prevent intellectual diversity, seek equal outcomes rather than equal opportunity, and excludes those who disagree with this progressive radical orthodoxy. And a lot of this, we can talk about the ideological failures, the return of the critical theory critical legal studies. When I was in law school, we had heard about this stuff, something from the 80s and early 90s that had been put back in a niche somewhere in sociology departments or something. Well, that all came roaring back. The idea that there's no objective truth, everything has to be viewed through an intersectional matrix, all of these sorts of things. All institutions are illegitimate. The law itself needs to be torn down and rebuilt because it's hopelessly imbued with racism and sexism and other power imbalances and things like that. So that failure of ideology, lots of people talk about, but there's a larger story of bureaucratic failure. The fact that all schools now have more non-teaching staff than faculty. And these non-teaching folks, the administrators and what have you, are much more radical even than left-leaning faculty. And almost all law schools are very left-leaning, but administrators are even more so. And so the number of university employees who didn't teach grew at twice the rate of students, while tuition more than tripled in the last 25 years. And these trends are particularly acute in so-called elite places. Yale's administration ballooned by nearly 50% from 2003 to 21. At Stanford, the number of administrators grew by 30% in 2017 to 22 alone. So the school now has nearly twice as many non-teaching staff as undergrads, nearly 6 times the number of administrators as faculty. And that's, this overbalancing, the tail that wags the dog, as bad as faculty bias might be, or what have you, this is worse. Apparatchiks with no connection to teaching or research chill speech and eviscerate due process. And so much of that bureaucratic growth, most of it in the last 10, 15 years, has come in the DEI space. Some of that's being cut back now. The University of Michigan just announced last week, I believe, that they were cutting their DEI office. Now, we have to be vigilant about whether they just rename it, reshuffle people. But Michigan's been spending more than $30 million a year, more than 250 full-time people on DEI. Staffs on average, in general at schools across the country, 4 times larger than those that provide mandated accommodations to students with disabilities. More DEI staff than history professors, on and on and on. So the real danger here is that universities no longer focus on free inquiry in pursuit of knowledge. Instead, they deploy an army of non-teaching educrats that either distracts from that mission by providing therapeutic coddling or actively prevents truth-seeking by enforcing an ideological orthodoxy. And the bitter irony is that these DEI offices fail on their own terms. If you look at campus climate surveys, how comfortable students are on campus, how much of a sense of belonging they feel, generally comfort with diversity specifically, all of these are inversely correlated with the size and budgets of DEI offices. So, having these staff organize trainings and rallies and struggle sessions to enforce narrow perspectives on race and sex and class prevents the development of critical thinking skills that students need to become well-adjusted professionals. And again, it shifts power away from faculty and gives it to political commissars. So we can talk about, what can be done about this. I'm generally an all of the above kind of guy. That is, have employers involved who say, we're not going to hire people who yell at federal judges, we hope your daughters are raped. We have state legislators who, for public schools at least, cut out these bureaucracies and prevent diversity hiring based on diversity statements or admissions, things like that. At the federal level, we now have launched, I've seen the Trump administration launch tons of investigations against various schools for civil rights, free speech violations, anti-Semitism, what have you. Federal judges, about 14, are boycotting Yale and Stanford and Columbia for clerk hiring. And then there's, parallel institutions that are arising. Hard to do in the law school space because of the ABA's monopoly on accreditation, which is an even less sexy topic to discuss than bureaucracy, but very, very important. That's why there's not, we should have competing accreditors. We should have, different certifications by different organizations. But we don't. So there's Again, failure of ideology, bureaucracy, and a failure of leadership. Too few presidents, provosts, department chairs, law school deans follow the example of the late University of Chicago president, Bob Zimmer, who, when he was asked to punish a professor who was criticizing affirmative action, said, "I'm not in the speech police business. You don't like what professors are saying, even if they're criticizing me, I'm not gonna, that's their freedom. You can write a letter to the editor of the school paper, you can blog, you can have them protest, all these things. Don't look at me to police speech." There's too few examples like the Vanderbilt chancellor, Daniel Diermeyer, who ejected and expelled students who had taken over his office last year. Very low bar, right? But contrast this basic level of leadership with the norm, which is like the now successive presidents of Columbia or Penn or what have you. So, when I left Georgetown, I wasn't holding my breath at the prospect of reform. Maybe now we're finally starting to see somewhat of a backlash to our illiberal inquisitors. But we're in the eye of the storm, and we need public exposure. It's very important. My colleague now at the Manhattan Institute, John Saylor, who's an investigative reporter, does all these FOIA requests of public institutions and gets all these really incriminating documents about all sorts of racial discrimination, using diversity statements to hire economists or biologists or what have you. And as soon as this is exposed with like one op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, the next day the president or the chancellor says, "No, we're not going to do that." It's a shaming mechanism, and it's pretty good. But it's the question is whether higher education grandees are willing to do the work in the parlance of the woke to restore their tarnished stature. There's still a long way to go before universities return to their mission of seeking truth and knowledge, and law schools return to their goal of teaching future lawyers to uphold the rule of law. But the battle's been joined. So hopefully that's enough of an overview. Happy to discuss any of that, my own case with Georgetown, or anything else on which you think I can feign expertise.
Absolutely. So we had a few questions that we wanted to sort of run through with you and get your take on. So the first one was about the difference between illiberal and illiberal versus right versus left. And one of the conversations that I've tried to have is to be able to express that these are two totally different ideas on two separate axes. And as an example of that, in your book, you quote FIRE, which is an organization which is dedicated towards free speech, and it has taken up both left-wing and right-wing causes. And it was something that actually last night, both Dr. Roberts as well as a very left-leaning student that came to the event were both at least able to reach and have similarity in terms of admiration for that organization. In terms of FIRE, if we look at different schools, we can see that like even very conservative schools like Hillsdale College are actually marked red. This red means illiberal in the same way that very liberal institutions like Yale or Georgetown, which you discuss at length in your book, are also marked red. Would you say that the problem is not necessarily about right versus left, but rather having people of different sort of backgrounds being able to come together? Or do you think that the issue is much more intrinsically linked to the left, if that makes sense? In other words, it seems like when the right has total control, this also seems to be an issue. And so what we really need is to be able to have that open discourse.
Well, look, it's broader than free speech. The basics of what you're saying is correct as far as it goes, and certainly there can be and there is illiberalism of the right, not on campus. Campuses are, with the exception of places like Hillsdale or Liberty University or Grove City, controlled by the left, and not just kind of moderate Democrats by the far left. I think 40% of administrators nationwide self-identify as far left. They're about 12 or 15 to 1 overall, and far left self-identify. Anyway, but it's not, illiberal is not a degree of leftness or rightness. It's about, do you believe in objective reality, in the idea of objective truth, and in the legitimacy of our structures and systems. That sure, they can and need reform of various kinds, but it's not that the whole idea of due process or equal protection or free speech is illegitimate, because you have to know what time it is to use the language of the right, and we can blow through those things to achieve certain kinds of goals because we don't have the luxury of being able to go through proper rule of law processes or something like that, or have a debate about this. We need to shut down this other side because it's so dangerous and illegitimate and all the rest of it. So in society writ large, that comes from both sides, although there's been more violence from the left, even in society at large. On campus, this is almost exclusively a left-wing problem where they don't even realize, especially university leaders, this is the problem with university leaders. It's not that they themselves are illiberal or woke radicals or social justice lawyers. Very few university presidents or law school deans are that kind. But they live in this bubble where kind of the left becomes kind of the center, and the far left, the illiberal, is just, oh well, we'll just placate them. Well, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and that's about it. The Overton window that people talk about, where it's not acceptable to criticize affirmative action or abortion, or to invite judges appointed by President Trump because that whole regime is illegitimate, and things like this. That not just our civil rights laws or constitutional interpretation, but our securities laws and water regulations are illegitimate because of historic redlining and all of these, all sorts of things. So again, as I gave the example of the Berkeley hippies in the 60s, yeah, this is not, free speech is a tool of the privileged, and all of that is part of the worldview of the illiberal left.
Makes sense. Another question. So in your book, you discuss administrative bloat. It seems like this would have a large impact on raising tuition prices and making law school even more unaffordable for many of the marginalized groups that a lot of the sort of, are higher up on the intersectional categories, if that makes sense. Does this sort of conflict seem apparent to you? And what do you think, how do you sort of rectify it, if that makes sense?
Absolutely. I mean, the growth in tuition has outpaced inflation, even during our recent, what for America has been higher than normal inflationary period. And yeah, most of that is driven by bureaucracy. It's also that as the government took over being the sponsor of student loans and then kept raising the limit, universities said, okay, well, we'll raise our prices in conjunction with the increase in government-backed student loans, and so that's a vicious spiral that drives student debt problems. Maybe a little less for law students because most law students do get jobs. There's more of an issue at lower ranking schools, that there's even an element of fraud. Come here, we'll let you in with low LSAT scores, which is an indicator of failing the bar and things like this. But it's especially in college and other grad schools and things like that, where you're going into severe debt to get a worthless degree. One of the ways to reform that is to require universities to have some skin in the game. And if your graduates can't find jobs, then part of that loan, part of that onus should be on you. And then maybe you can tailor your admissions policies, tailor your academic advisors, so we don't have so many people graduating in useless majors with no practical skills.
That makes sense. Another question, dealing more on sort of the anti-Semitism side of things. What actions do you think are correct, and how do we make sure that there isn't a backlash? For instance, it seems like there's almost a catch 2020 or catch 2022, where if conservatives say, "Hey, we're going to fight anti-Semitism," then all of a sudden the left sort of takes it up as, oh, well, now it's going too far, there's oppression, and now you'll see sort of more radical actions being taken. And at the same time, if no one does anything, then that's a huge issue as well. So what's the correct action and the correct balance there to actually make sure that we can sort of, to the best of our abilities, stymie out anti-Semitism and actually have true tolerance of different perspectives?
I wrote an essay in the fall of 23 for the Free Press, which you might want to put in the chat. I'll try to find it while I'm speaking here. That delineates not so much the limits of free speech, but understanding what free speech is, especially in the campus context. So nobody should be penalized or expelled or disciplined for pure speech. There are things, however, that are not speech. So, for example, if you beat someone up because you don't like their political views, your motivation is purely speech oriented, it's purely politically oriented. You don't get a defense against an assault charge for doing that. Or a more creative one that I saw about a year and a half ago. Yeah, there you go. Thank you. Is someone urinated on a Hillel, Jewish student building, and claimed a defense of, well, I'm expressing myself. No, you don't get a First Amendment defense to public urination, vandalism, what have you. So there are things that are not speech, assault, vandalism, trespassing, these sorts of things. Then there is unprotected speech. So, having, law students, you go through this, the standards for incitement of violence, for example, it's a high bar, the Brandenburg rule, right? You have to be specific and direct and imminent. So just giving a speech about how terrible Israel is, or even how terrible Jews are, it's not enough. It has to be, concluding your speech with, and therefore any Jew you see today, punch them in the face, something like that. Or directing it at, marching to the Hillel and having your rally, right there, which gets into intimidation and harassment, which is also not protected speech. Or even core political speech then gets into sort of a third category, which is time, place, and manner regulations that, as lawyers, we need to be familiar with. So in the non-campus example, I can't go to your neighborhood where you live in the middle of the night at 2 a.m. and use a bullhorn to tell you exactly what I think of Donald Trump and Kamala Harris and whatever else. Pure political speech, core speech, not anti-Semitic or anything, just my political views. But you can't do that. That's disturbing the peace. And so in the campus context, you can't disrupt classes. You can't block students' access to buildings. Even apart from harassment and intimidation, there's certain rules. If you're, having a large rally that's right next to a classroom, or if you're like parading down the halls and disrupting things, you can't do that. That's why you have parade permits in the real world. Off campus, you can't just block a road with your political speech. Again, whether it's hate speech or not, and hate speech is protected, by the way. It's these other categories that you have to understand. So universities have been terrible in, on the one hand, not protecting speech that's politically incorrect in the campus context, coming from the non-progressive perspective, and then not punishing non-speech, actual violence, intimidation, the takeover of Hamilton Hall at Columbia, all of these encampments and things like that. It's just been a failure of leadership. It's not a matter of this is a new problem that we need to theorize novel solutions because it's so difficult. It's the policies are right there. Every university, due to the work of FIRE and others, has very good, almost everyone has good free speech policies on paper or on pixels, and very good delineation of what's a disruption or what's harassment or what have you. But they're not enforced. So that's what needs to be done. And it's not, in my view, that being Jewish has to be added to the pantheon or the hierarchy of privilege or what have you, as being recalibrate our DEI matrix. No, I don't think that when you play that victimhood Olympics, then nobody wins.
That makes sense. Another question. So you speak in your book about the ABA monopoly on accreditation. And in that, you mention a rule that is sort of dealing with other conduct or problematic conduct. In our state of Maryland, we recently had a first case come out where there were sort of internal communications that were, overtly racist and very inappropriate. My concern is that where do we draw the boundaries and the lines of that? And, I think the case that you had at Georgetown is a perfect case where there's not overt racism. There was someone that took it to be that, and it was sort of a distortion of the facts. And that caused a lot of problematic ramifications. Well, if we're going to have an adoption of these ABA rules, it seems like the next thing to go could be perhaps climate change or vaccine mandates or something along that line. And now we're not able to actually have lawyers that can take up different causes and actually defend those clients that are not sort of couth or don't correct, if that makes sense. So what can we do about this? How do we sort of, make sure that we're able to maintain the integrity of our legal system going forward?
Yeah. I said that universities' free speech policies are generally very good, which is true, but some lack a safe harbor for complaints about pure speech. That is, if your complaint is not that a professor, administrator, what have you, is taking adverse action against you because of your race, sex, whatever else. If it's just that you're offended by something he or she said, that should be instantly dismissed. So, I mean, there can be kind of speech-based misconduct in the sense that if you're supposed to be teaching torts and you start teaching about the Civil War, well, you're not doing your job. So, yeah, technically it's that you're speaking, but you're not doing the job that you were hired to do. That's a little different than complaining or disciplining or subjecting someone to investigation for extramural speech that someone doesn't like. So that distinction between action and speech, which is the distinction in employment law, for example, and anti-discrimination law, that's what needs to be in place in higher ed.
That makes sense. And then another question that we saw was you mentioned the Free Press and Barry Weiss. I had recently seen Roland Fryer, who is a Harvard economist, who had come out with research that stated that there was police discriminations in shootings, or sorry, in lower police activity, but not in shootings. And although Obama had congratulated him originally, because of that later finding about the shootings, there was a large blowback, and he actually had to have security. Roland Fryer is African American, and comes from a very poor background. And despite this, when asked on the recent PBD podcast about does he support DEI, he had said yes, because even though there was a weaponization of DEI and it was taken way too far, to completely get rid of it is, not the correct answer either. This was something that seemed to be also spoken about by Jonathan McWhorter and Glenn Lowry on one of the recent Glenn Show episodes. I was wondering for you, do you think that DEI needs to get removed completely? Or do you think that there needs to be a recalibration so that we're still supporting minority people, but we're doing it in a more constructive way?
Um, End it, don't mend it is the short answer. What I've been talking about, what my colleague Chris Rufo has been talking about, is not what those of us of Roland and John and my age knew when we were in college or grad school. The lawyers and their staffs that were dealing with compliance with federal and state civil rights laws, be that Title IX, be that Title VI, lots of other rules about anti-discrimination and equal opportunity. DEI goes beyond that. It's not legally required. It doesn't help the treatment of minorities or underprivileged people. I mean, think about all that money spent at Michigan or in the University of California system on DEI. Why not give that as scholarships to underprivileged kids, or tutorial support if you're struggling because of your background or something like that? These structures don't add anything, and as I mentioned, typically actually subtract from the college experience for everyone. If you could find, or I can find, the proposal, the model legislation that Chris Rufo and I put together in January of 23, so just over 2 years ago, explains all this and kind of gave guidance to state legislatures, a lot of whom acted on it. And in some states, there was enough executive authority under their state constitutions to act on those. So no, it's not a matter of, DEI is not about treating racial minorities nicely or sexual minorities or what have you. It's about reorienting our whole vision of how society should be structured. It's not anti-discrimination law. It's not civil rights law. That can stay. I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. You should still, if you're taking federal money, you shouldn't be using that to discriminate against people based on these various characteristics. But DEI is not that. It's fomenting a cultural revolution.
Following up with sort of the DEI that's in legal academia, different law schools recently have been adopting different policies. For instance, University of Virginia completely got rid of their DEI, where Georgetown is refusing to take that step. Do you think these educational differences are going to create lawyers that are vastly different and view the law differently? And is this going to be problematic in our legal system?
Um, yeah, probably. I mean, as there are differences as among states. Now, some of those states are engaged in massive resistance to the law, to enforcement of the law. So I hope that the Department of Education, while it exists, and the Justice Department Civil Rights Division investigates these schools that are going against the law and trying to play fast and loose. Um, but ultimately, yeah, the training that people receive at different schools already is somewhat different because some have an emphasis on, say, environmental law, others have an emphasis on corporate law, others, there are differences among law schools beyond just where they happen to be on the U.S. News ranking. And I could see, yeah, different state regulations, different state cultures could lead to different kinds of lawyers. And I know I joined late. I have to leave a few minutes before 1 as well.
Jake, you're muted.
There you go.
My apologies. Sorry about that. All right, I'm going to open up to everyone else. Does anyone else have any questions that they'd like to ask? Okay, very good. I guess I'll ask one final question if it's all right. I saw on the Megyn Kelly show when you were on with her, you did say that the Manhattan Institute is looking for conservative attorneys. Is that still the case? And if so, I think we have some members that might have interest. Would it be all right if we sent you their resumes?
Yeah, we're always looking for good people, both as interns, including during the school year. We have virtual law school interns part-time. You can look at the application and fill that out online. Don't just send me stuff because I'll be like, okay, I'll pass this along. But that you can apply directly. You can let me know if you apply, and then after you graduate, yeah, from time to time we might hire a young lawyer for a year or two, something like that. Getting in as a summer or school year intern will certainly help first.
Fantastic. I truly appreciate you taking the time and speaking with us today. Thank you so much.
All right, take care.
Bye bye.